He was the most feared man in London until he woke up in a public ward, ignored by the only woman who didn't care about his last name. Before we continue, we ask you to support our channel by liking this video and subscribing. Your participation is essential for us to keep bringing you captivating stories like this one. The sky over London on that oppressive Tuesday morning was a familiar shade of worn pewter, a flat, melancholic grey that seemed to press the city down against the damp tarmac. On the 48th floor of one of Canary Wharf's most imposing glass and steel canyons, the headquarters of Finchworth Holdings pulsed with the controlled energy of power and ruthless ambition. At the heart of this universe, in a panoramic office that offered an almost divine view of the indifferent metropolis, reigned Alistair Finch. At 39, he was the personification of success in its most unforgiving form. Wealthy to the point that fortune was an abstract concept, possessing a sharp, masculine beauty that time had only honed with severe lines, and armed with a cutting sarcasm he used as both weapon and shield, Alistair had inherited and quintupled his family's technology and investment empire with a competence that intimidated rivals and exhausted subordinates. He was accustomed to a world that bent to his will, where doors opened with a single phone call and desires were met before they were fully formed. His life was a succession of business victories and fleeting personal conquests. The women who crossed his path were like luxury assets in a rotating collection, admired for their beauty and discarded with equal ease when the novelty faded. For Alistair, everything and everyone had a price, a function, an expiration date. Life, however, with its often cruel irony, has a habit of reminding the most powerful of their intrinsic fragility. It was during a hostile takeover presentation in a boardroom filled with investors hanging on his every word that Alistair, Finch's perfectly controlled universe, suffered a sudden, violent collapse. In the middle of an explanation of market synergies, a sharp, searing pain tore through his right side, stealing his breath and his posture. He tried to disguise it, leaning discreetly on the polished mahogany table, but a wave of nausea and cold sweat betrayed him. He staggered, his vision blurring at the edges, and collapsed onto the plush carpet before his security detail could reach him. The diagnosis received hours. Later, after an emergency admission to the most exclusive private clinic in Mayfair, was as banal as it was terrifying: acute appendicitis, complicated by the onset of peritonitis. The surgery was rushed, but successful. However, an unexpected post-operative infection and a momentary overcrowding of the clinic's luxury wing, due to a minor norovirus outbreak among the city's elite, resulted in a situation unthinkable for a man like him. With no private suites available, no possibility of an isolated room with bespoke service and privileges, Alistair Finch was transferred, to his complete and utter outrage, to a general ward at St. Thomas's Hospital, a major public NHS hospital with which the private clinic had an overflow agreement. The transition from his pedestal of power to the raw reality of an NHS hospital bed was a brutal shock. The ward, though clean, was a stark, impersonal space, and he shared it with 3 other men, including an elderly gentleman who snored with a rhythmic, rattling tenacity. The scent of antiseptic mingled with the smells of institutional food and human frailty. The constant, multi-toned beeping of monitors was an irritating soundtrack, and privacy was a non-existent luxury, marked only by thin, pale blue curtains. Furious, humiliated, and feeling like a prisoner in his own debilitated body, he unleashed his frustration on the first figure of authority he saw, a junior doctor, weary-faced but with a steady gaze, who came to check his vitals. "This is an absolute farce, an outrage. I am Alistair Finch of Finchworth Holdings. I demand an immediate transfer to a private room. I don't care what it costs," he snarled, his voice hoarse with pain and indignation. The doctor, unfazed, finished making notes on his chart and looked at him with disarming calm. "Mr. Finch, with all due respect to us and to the bacteria currently colonizing your peritoneum, your inflamed appendix has no idea who you are or how many companies you own. Our priority is your health, and at the moment this is the only bed available. I suggest you try to get some rest. The staff nurse for this shift will be around shortly to administer your medication." Her words, delivered with a near surgical serenity, were a velvet-gloved slap to his inflated ego, leaving him stunned, furious, and for the first time in a very long time, utterly powerless. While Alistair wrestled with his new, humiliating reality, in another corridor of that same sprawling hospital, the quiet, methodical routine of Eleanor Vance unfolded as it did every other night. At 27, Eleanor was an exemplary nurse, a professional whose competence and dedication were known to all, even if her discreet and introspective nature kept her on the periphery of the social circles and gossip that permeated the hospital environment. She was punctual, efficient, and possessed an almost supernatural ability to perform the most delicate procedures with a firmness and gentleness that calmed even the most anxious patients. However, there was a trait that distinguished her from everyone else. She never, ever smiled. Not a true, open smile. Her lips might curve into a polite gesture of understanding, but a genuine smile, the kind that lights up a face and reveals the soul, seemed to have been exiled from her features. Her colleagues, with a mixture of admiration and a touch of bewilderment, didn't have a specific nickname for her, but they spoke of her with a certain reverence, as if she were a force of nature. "Vance is on shift," they'd say, and it meant the ward would run with the precision of a Swiss watch. She was a rock of competence, of reliability, but also a rock of contained emotion, seemingly immune to flirting, jokes, or any attempt at personal connection. No one knew the origin of the serious wall she had built around herself, and few dared to try and breach it. The first encounter between the impatient magnate and the enigmatic nurse took place under the cold, impersonal glare of the ward's fluorescent lights. Eleanor Vance entered the space with her usual discretion, her soft-soled shoes making almost no sound on the linoleum floor, carrying a tray with his prescribed medications. Alistair, who had spent the last few hours stewing in his rage and impotence, saw her as an easy target for his habitual sarcasm, a way to vent his frustration. As she approached, he managed a wry smile, his voice dripping with the arrogance he wore like armor. "At last! You must be the head matron, I assume. I do hope that in this establishment, CEOs are afforded a bit more glamour and consideration than the common mortals. A VIP treatment would be the least I'd expect, given the circumstances." Eleanor, however, showed no reaction to his provocation. Her eyes, a deep, calm brown of unnerving serenity, barely lingered on him. With silent efficiency, she checked his IV drip, measured his blood pressure with precise, firm movements, noted the data on the chart at the foot of his bed, changed the saline bag for a new one containing antibiotics, and without saying a single word, turned and left the bay, pulling the curtain gently behind her. Her indifference, the way his barb had been utterly ignored, as if he were just another inanimate object to be serviced, left Alistair speechless. He, who was accustomed to commanding attention, admiration, or at the very least, fear from everyone around him, had been treated with a neutrality so absolute, it was almost insulting. "Right," he murmured into the silence of his curtained-off space, a mix of irritation and a burgeoning intrigue beginning to bubble in his chest. "A challenge, then. Let's see how long it takes for that rock to crack." In the days that followed, Alistair's recovery was slow and frustrating, but his peculiar new obsession with eliciting any kind of emotional reaction from Eleanor Vance became his primary pastime. He turned his hospital bed into a stage for his provocations. Testing, the limits of the nurse's patience and impassivity with an arsenal of strategies that ranged from calculated charm to the most biting sarcasm. He tried clever jokes, comments on the inefficiencies of the National Health Service, ironic compliments on her contagious joy, and even hinted at hiring her as his private nurse for a life-changing salary. But nothing worked. Eleanor remained immune, a fortress of professionalism and silence. She entered his bay at the prescribed times, performed her duties with the same methodical efficiency, answered his direct questions about his treatment with precise monosyllables, and completely ignored him when he tried to steer the conversation toward personal or provocative territory. Her indifference was so consistent, so unshakable, that it began to infuriate Alistair in a way he hadn't experienced in years. On one particularly tedious afternoon, feeling once again invisible to this enigmatic woman's eyes, he decided to be more direct. "Tell me." "Something, Nurse Vance," he said, his voice laced with a poorly disguised impatience as she adjusted his IV drip. "Are you always like this? An ice statue in a perfectly pressed uniform? Or do you just see me as an IV bag with an unlimited credit card, an object to be fixed and discarded?" The question, loaded with a frustration and a sincerity he hadn't intended, finally seemed to pierce her professional armor. She finished her task, turned slowly, and for the first time since they'd met, looked directly into Alistair's eyes, and what he saw there surprised him. There was no anger, no fear, no embarrassment. There was only a deep serenity, an ancient weariness, and a disarming clarity. Her lips, usually set in a neutral line, moved softly. "I treat all my patients as patients, Mr. Finch," she said, her voice low, calm, but with a timbre that allowed for no argument. "Nothing more, nothing less. Illness is the great equalizer, and my job is to care for the illness, not the social status of the person who carries it." It was the first time she had held his gaze, the first time she had addressed him with a full sentence that wasn't strictly technical. And in that instant, in that brief and intense eye contact, Alistair felt something he wasn't used to feeling, something that disarmed him completely and made him feel strangely vulnerable. Respect, a genuine respect, not for the efficient nurse, but for the strong, principled woman who had revealed herself from behind the silence. The rock, he realized, hadn't cracked. It had merely shown him for a brief moment the solidity of its foundation. From that brief, significant confrontation, Alistair's perception of Eleanor began to shift. The initial irritation gave way to a deeper curiosity, a more attentive observation. He started paying attention not just to what she did, but how she did it. From his hospital bed, which had become a sort of private box for the theater of real life, he began to see the woman. Behind the uniform, the soul behind the rock. He watched, with a growing admiration, how she cared for the other patients in the ward. He saw the almost filial tenderness with which she adjusted the pillow of a confused elderly man in the next bed, whispering words of comfort that seemed to instantly soothe his agitation. He witnessed the gentle firmness with which she held the hand of a frightened child from the pediatric wing who had wandered onto their ward, turning the fear of a routine check-up into a moment of trust and bravery. He noticed most of all how she always stepped aside, becoming invisible whenever a doctor praised her work in front of others or when a patient's family tried to thank her with a gift or effusive words. She didn't seek recognition, didn't feed on praise. Her satisfaction seemed to come from an internal source, from a sense of duty and compassion that were as natural to her as breathing. This new perspective on Eleanor led Alistair to reflect on himself, on the shallowness of his own relationships, on the way he had always used his power and wealth as tools to get what he wanted, to impress, to control. One afternoon, feeling particularly introspective and perhaps a little starved for a conversation that wasn't about his vital signs, He tried again to break her barrier of silence, but this time with an honesty that surprised even himself. "You know, Eleanor," he began, his voice devoid of sarcasm, "you're different from any woman I've ever met in my entire life." He paused, and she looked up from his chart, her expression unreadable. "Every woman who crosses my path sooner or later seems to bow before my bank account, my family name, the power I represent. It's a predictable and frankly rather boring ritual." Eleanor considered his words for a moment before replying. Her answer, delivered with a devastating simplicity and strength, was like an arrow that pierced all of Alistair's defenses, striking the very core of his soul. "I learned, Mr. Finch, to bow with all due respect and reverence before the dying, before pain, and before the fragility of human life. I see no reason at all to bow before someone who merely thinks they have the right to live above others." He remained in absolute silence, her words echoing in his mind, resonating in parts of his conscience he didn't know existed. For the first time in his adult life, perhaps for the first time ever, someone hadn't seen him as the CEO, the millionaire, the Finch name. Someone had seen him simply as a human being, and that realization, so simple and yet so profound, left him completely stripped bare and vulnerable. Alistair's wall of cynicism and arrogance, already shaken by Eleanor's cutting honesty, began to crumble definitively during a long and difficult night. An unexpected complication in his post-surgical recovery triggered a crisis of intense pain, a pain that not even the most potent analgesic seemed to quell. He writhed in the bed, drenched in a cold sweat, his breathing ragged, feeling completely at the mercy of his own rebellious body. It was Eleanor who stayed with him through those endless hours, with a calm and competence that was both professional and deeply human. She didn't just administer the prescribed medication, she remained by his side, constantly monitoring his vitals, applying cool cloths to his forehead, adjusting his position to find some relief, and, most importantly, offering him her silent, reassuring presence, which seemed to have a more calming effect than any sedative. In the throes of his agony, in a moment of extreme vulnerability, Alistair looked at her. His eyes clouded with suffering, and a question escaped his lips. A question that came from the depths of his confused, newly awakened soul. "Eleanor, why? Why are you taking care of me like this, with such dedication, after all my provocations, my arrogance, even knowing I'm the kind of person who probably doesn't deserve this? Any kind of care?" Eleanor, who was wringing out a cloth in a basin of cool water, paused and looked at him, her expression something he couldn't decipher. It wasn't pity or judgment, just a deep, serene observation. "And who are you to decide whether you deserve it or not, Mr. Finch?" she replied softly, her question returning the weight of his own arrogance back to him. "Do you truly believe you don't deserve to be cared for when you are in pain, when you are fragile?" Her simple, direct question hit him with the force of an epiphany. He, who had always considered himself the supreme judge of everyone and everything, who had always felt entitled to the best, to demand the most, was now confronted with the idea of his own worthiness, or lack thereof. I don't know," he confessed, his voice weak, the physical pain mingling with an existential anguish he had never felt before. Maybe before meeting you, before hearing your words, I would have said yes, that I deserved everything, but now I'm not so sure." The honesty in his answer, the admission of his own doubt, seemed to touch something in Eleanor. And then, for the first time since they had met, a genuine open smile lit up her face. It wasn't forced, nor was it a polite gesture. It was a smile that came from within, that reached her eyes and made them shine with a warm, unexpected light. In that instant, amid the pain and the gloom of the hospital ward, Alistair Finch had an absolute certainty. He wanted more than any business deal, more than any conquest, to see that smile again and again, at any cost. The next day, however, the fragile bridge that seemed to have been built between them was abruptly dismantled. Alistair woke feeling physically better, but with a strange sense of anticipation, waiting for Eleanor's morning shift. She didn't come. A cheerful, talkative young nurse named Ben took her place. When the afternoon came and Eleanor again failed to appear, and the same thing happened the next day, he knew her absence was deliberate. He felt a pang of disappointment so sharp it surprised him. Impatient, he finally managed to intercept her in a corridor as she was leaving her shift on another ward. "Eleanor, wait!" he called out, his voice more urgent than he intended. "Why have you disappeared? Why are you avoiding me? What did I do wrong?" Eleanor stopped, visibly uncomfortable with the direct confrontation in the busy hallway. Her face was closed off, the old mask of professional indifference back in place, but her eyes couldn't hide a shadow of conflict. "Mr. Finch, please, don't make things more difficult," she said, her voice low and controlled. "You are recovering well. My presence is no longer required." "That's not what I'm talking about. And you know it," he insisted. "Something happened between us that night. A connection. And now you're running away. I need to know why." His persistence seemed to break her. She let out a tired, resigned sigh. "You are confusing a patient's gratitude with something else, Mr. Finch. You're mistaking the vulnerability of illness for a feeling that doesn't exist. And that cannot happen, not with me." With that, she turned and walked away quickly, leaving him standing alone in the middle of the corridor, his heart aching with a sense of loss he couldn't comprehend, but which was undeniably real. Her rejection, her clinical dismissal of his feelings, left Alistair shaken and deeply intrigued. He knew with a certainty that frightened him that what he felt wasn't simple gratitude, it was more. Her determination to push him away felt almost desperate, indicating a fear he couldn't understand. Determined to uncover the mystery, he began to listen more closely to the hospital's undercurrents. He used his influence subtly to speak with older staff members. It was from Arthur, an elderly and compassionate hospital porter with a kind face and a lifetime of stories, that he finally learned the truth. A truth that filled him with a mixture of rage, sorrow, and a profound empathy for Eleanor. Years earlier, Eleanor Vance, then a young, idealistic, newly qualified nurse, had been harassed by an influential patient, a well-known member of Parliament. The man had made unacceptable advances. Eleanor, with her unshakable integrity, had reported him to hospital management. Instead of support, she was met with disbelief, accused of misinterpreting the situation, and subtly threatened with the loss of her job if she pursued the matter. The politician's connections buried the scandal, and Eleanor, humiliated and traumatized, was forced to swallow the injustice to keep her livelihood. Since then, Arthur explained, she had closed herself off completely, building an impenetrable fortress around herself, especially when it came to male patients, and most especially powerful ones. The revelation hit Alistair like a physical blow. He finally understood. He understood the rock, the reason for the silence, the distance, the fear of any involvement that could be misconstrued. And in that moment, standing by a window overlooking the grey Thames, he felt not a shred of offence at her rejection. All he felt was an even greater admiration for her strength and a deep, burning rage at the injustice she had suffered. The game he thought he was playing was over. He had been a fool. His mission was no longer to crack her or to win her attention. It was to prove somehow that he was different. It was to be worthy of her trust. The discovery of Eleanor's past trauma fundamentally altered Alistair's objective. The arrogant desire to break her resistance, to provoke a reaction, dissolved into a new, unfamiliar feeling. The profound wish to earn her trust, to help heal her wounds, to prove that he was different. For the first time in his life, he wasn't thinking of conquering, possessing, or winning. He was thinking of caring, respecting, and being worthy of someone's affection. He stopped trying to force encounters or conversations, understanding that she needed space and time. Instead, he began to change himself from the inside out. He started to pay attention to the people around him, to see the human beings behind the uniforms and job titles. He began talking to the hospital staff, not with the arrogance of a VIP patient, but with genuine interest. He asked the porter, Arthur, about his grandchildren. He listened to the stories of the tea lady who brought him his lukewarm tea. He complimented the diligence of the cleaning crew. These small shifts, which might seem trivial to anyone else, were a Copernican revolution in Alistair Finch's behavior. The staff, initially wary, began to notice the transformation. "Are you seeing this?" one nurse whispered to another, watching Alistair offer his untouched fruit cup to the elderly man in the next bed. The Alistair Finch, the terror of the city, acting like a decent human being. Must be the medication. But it wasn't the medication. It was the Eleanor effect. Knowing that words would be insufficient to prove his change and reach Eleanor's wounded heart, Alistair decided to act. He had observed in his conversations with staff the special affection she held for the hospital's pediatric wing, a chronically underfunded sector where children faced serious illnesses in a dreary, unwelcoming environment. He recalled her mentioning, with a shadow of sadness in her voice, the lack of toys, the outdated equipment, the need for a more cheerful and humane space for the young patients. That's when Alistair had his idea. Using his contacts and influence, but with absolute anonymity, he orchestrated a major donation to the hospital trust, specifically earmarked for the complete renovation of the pediatric wing. New hospital beds and cots, state-of-the-art monitoring equipment, educational toys, a colorful and well-equipped playroom, and even the hiring of art therapists and storytellers to brighten the children's days. The gesture was attributed to an anonymous benefactor, and no one, except his most trusted solicitor, knew the origin of the funds. Alistair didn't want credit or publicity. He simply wanted to materialize the compassion he had learned from Eleanor, to show her, even from a distance, that her example had resonated within him. He wanted her to see that good could be done quietly, without applause or recognition, a value he knew she held dear. The day of Alistair's discharge finally arrived. He was physically recovered, but emotionally in a state of turmoil he didn't know how to manage. The prospect of leaving the hospital, of no longer having the excuse of his illness to be, in some way, near Eleanor, filled him with an anxiety far more terrifying than any surgical complication. He knew he had to speak to her one last time. He waited patiently at the end of her corridor, near the staff exit, knowing she would have to pass by at the end of her shift. When Eleanor saw him, her first instinct was to turn away, but the expression on his face, a mixture of pleading and resolve, made her stop. "Eleanor, please, just a minute," he asked, his voice low but firm. You're leaving tomorrow, aren't you?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly, avoiding his gaze. "Yes, I'm leaving tomorrow," he confirmed, taking a step toward her. "And the truth, Eleanor, is that I don't want to go. Not without telling you that you've changed. Everything for me. You made me see the world and myself in a way I didn't know was possible. And I think I'm falling in love with you, with the incredible woman you are, with your strength, your kindness, your silence that says more than 1,000 words." Alistair's declaration, so direct and vulnerable, struck Eleanor with the force of a physical blow. She stared at him, her eyes wide, her heart hammering against her ribs. Part of her wanted to flee, to protect herself, to dismiss it as the grateful ramblings of a patient, but another part, a part she had long suppressed, felt an immense joy, a hope she hadn't allowed herself to feel in years. "Mr. Finch, Alistair," she began, her voice hesitant. I also felt something, a connection, and it terrified me, because I've learned to protect myself, to never have expectations. Then, with the same courage that had allowed her to face him down on their first meeting, she revealed what she believed was her greatest barrier. "I've never let anyone in, Alistair. Not really. After what happened to me, I decided it was safer to be a rock, a fortress. It's the only way I've known how to survive." He moved closer, his gaze overflowing with a tenderness and respect that made her tremble. He stopped just inches from her, but made no move to touch her, respecting her space, her fear. "Eleanor, that fortress isn't a weakness. It's proof of your immense strength, of your incalculable worth. And if you'll let me," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "I don't want to storm the walls. I want to be the man who proves to you, day after day, gesture after gesture, that it's finally safe to open the gate. I am willing to wait as long as it takes to earn your trust." After Alistair was discharged, a disconcerting silence settled over Eleanor's life. Days turned into weeks, and there were no messages, no calls, no flowers. There was no sign that the man who had declared his feelings so passionately in the hospital corridor even remembered her. The absence of contact began to corrode the small hope that had blossomed in her heart. She tried to convince herself it had all been an illusion, the temporary infatuation of a rich, needy patient who, once returned to his world of power and glamour, had quickly forgotten the quiet nurse who had cared for him. "I was a fool, a complete and utter fool," she chided herself silently during the long, lonely night shifts, feeling the old, familiar sense of invisibility return with full force. How could I believe someone like him, a man who has the world at his feet, could be genuinely interested in someone like me? The smile, that rare and precious thing he had managed to draw out of her, retreated once more behind her mask of serious efficiency. The fortress was being rebuilt, stone by stone, in a desperate effort to protect a heart that once again felt on the brink of shattering. But what Eleanor didn't know was that Alistair's silence was not forgetfulness. It was preparation. He didn't want to approach her with empty gestures or promises that might ring hollow. He wanted his actions to speak louder than any words, and his next great action was about to be revealed. About 2 months after his discharge, unexpected news rocked the foundations of St. Thomas's Hospital. An official letter from the NHS Trust announced that the hospital had been selected to receive a massive multi-million-pound anonymous donation. It was specifically designated for the creation and complete modernization of a state-of-the-art palliative care wing, a sector of the hospital that had always been neglected and operated in desperately grim conditions. The news was met with celebration and disbelief by the entire staff. But the most surprising detail, the one that left Eleanor utterly stunned, was at the end of the official announcement. The donation, though anonymous in its origin, was made with a single unusual condition: that the new wing be publicly named and dedicated in honor of Nurse Eleanor Vance, in recognition of her compassion, integrity, and the humanized care that represents the highest ideals of her profession. Her name, once whispered only in corridors, was now associated with the largest single act of philanthropy in the hospital's recent history. She didn't know what to think, what to feel, but deep in her soul, a small flame of hope stubbornly reignited. A few days after the news had spread through the hospital, making Eleanor a reluctant celebrity among her peers, Alistair Finch reappeared. This time, he didn't arrive as a patient or as the powerful CEO. He walked through the main entrance like any other visitor, dressed in casual clothes without security, without the air of arrogance that had once defined him. He looked for Eleanor and found her in the newly opened, vibrant pediatric wing, the one she now visited often, feeling somehow a part of its transformation. Seeing him there, so different, so much more approachable, made Eleanor's heart leap. "Alistair," she whispered, her voice thick with an emotion she couldn't hide. "It was me, Eleanor," he said before she could even ask. "The donations, both of them. It was the only way I could think of to show you without words how much you impacted me, how much your values transformed me. And now," he continued, approaching her with a shy smile, "I'm no longer your patient. I'm just another volunteer who signed up to read stories to the children. And if you'll still have me, I would very much like to be your official suitor." His words, the humility of his actions, the sincerity in his eyes, they tore down the last remaining walls around Eleanor's heart. The tears that filled her eyes this time were not of pain or fear, but of a pure, overwhelming joy. "Alistair, I don't know what to say. It's the most beautiful thing anyone has ever done for me," she managed to say between happy sobs. He took her hands gently, his touch firm and warm, conveying a security she had never felt before. "I've been healing, Eleanor. In the time I was away, I wasn't just arranging donations. I was truly healing myself, not just my body, but my soul, which had been sick for a very long time. And you, with your silence, your strength, your integrity, you were the most powerful and effective medicine I have ever found." Eleanor smiled, a smile that was now full, radiant, illuminating her entire face and seeming to infect the very air around them. "And you, Alistair Finch, you were the only man in my entire life who didn't try to buy me with money or power. You were the only one who, instead, simply saw me." Months later, their lives had found a new, harmonious rhythm. Alistair, true to his word, still ran his global empire, but with a completely new, more humane and socially conscious perspective. And, religiously, 2 afternoons a week, he shed his CEO suit and donned the simple badge of a hospital volunteer, reading stories with funny voices to the children or simply talking with lonely patients in the palliative care wing that bore Eleanor's name. Eleanor, with Alistair's encouragement, had specialized and now coordinated an innovative new program for emotional support and patient advocacy, a project fully funded by the newly created Finchworth Foundation. She was still the dedicated, competent nurse, but the Rock had transformed into a beacon of empathy and hope, her once rare smile now a constant, comforting presence in the hospital corridors. Their love blossomed daily, built not on grand gestures, but on the solid foundation of mutual admiration, shared laughter, and a profound respect for each other's journeys. On a quiet Saturday afternoon, after a day of volunteering, Alistair took Eleanor for a walk in Regent's Park, among the blooming rose gardens. As they walked hand in hand down a path canopied by ancient trees, he stopped, turned to her, and from his coat pocket he pulled a small velvet box. Eleanor's heart skipped a beat. He opened the box to reveal a ring of stunning, understated elegance. No ostentatious diamond, just a simple, timeless platinum band. "Eleanor, my love," he began, his voice thick with emotion, "I never brought you flowers because you taught me that the most enduring beauty isn't in things that wither. I never took you to extravagant restaurants because I discovered the best flavor is in the simplicity of a sincere conversation. I never tried to impress you with my wealth because you taught me a man's true value isn't in his bank account. But today, I want to give you the only thing I have that is truly precious. I want to give you my name, my time, my respect, my loyalty. I want to give you my entire life so we can build ours together. Will you marry me?" Tears streamed down Eleanor's face, but they were tears of such complete, serene happiness that they seemed to wash away every last scar of her past. "Alistair," she whispered, her voice trembling, "you don't have to give me any of that, because you already gave me the one thing I never had, the one thing I didn't know was possible to find. You gave me peace." And with a kiss that sealed every promise in the world, she said the yes that would forever unite the man who had everything and the woman who had taught him the true value of it all.